I had 2 grandchildren over COVID, one for each child I have. Both daughters had children, and I realized that I wanted to move away from girly stuff. And so I started, and I like a good strong following on Instagram. I believe in Instagram. Started posting photographs from what I had done in New York during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And a woman named Gia from Chile, Gia Files, had told me how much she liked my work, and we did a swap where she sent me a fanzine she had done, and I sent her a fanzine I had done. And she said, at one point she said, well, why don't you do a book? And I laughed and said, impossible to do a book during COVID, impossible to do a book. It's not gonna happen. She said, well, talk to her publisher. So I did. He's in Toulouse. His name is Xavier. I'd seen a book in Mexico City at Frida Kahlo's house, and it was a 500-page book of Frida Kahlo photographs, and that's what I wanted to do. I had this vision that it would be kind of cool, that would cover all the years I was in New York. You know, in my world, you don't know who's going to survive or who's going to be more important, all this kind of stuff. David Wojnarowicz, who lived in the Lower East Side, who I started getting involved with to photograph what he was doing. He was in this gallery called Civilian Warfare Gallery on, I don't know, it was in the Lower East Side somewhere. I started hanging out with him and photographing what he was involved with, and he was involved in a building that was abandoned on the pier, and it turned out years later that I read that this is where he used to go trolling for men, and his father had done, had spent some time down there as a merchant marine. At one point, I went with David to his apartment. I went to his apartment in the Lower East Side, and he took one of his heads, and we started walking through the East Village down to Canal Street, down to Hudson River, and outside he was standing at the edge of the Hudson River, and he said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yeah." I had no idea what was going to happen. And he drops this piece of artwork that he had made into the Hudson River, gone at the bottom of the Hudson River. And that was interesting. I liked that a lot. So that was the cover. That turned out to be, in the end, the cover image. What stands out is the various memorials that were being given at the time for our mutual friends who had AIDS, who had died of AIDS. And he was very political. Hi, babe. And he would start shouting. It would start out kind of normal voice, and then he'd get angrier and angrier about the lack of funding, which was like, really, I'm glad you like this image, sweetie. Lack of funding. So his voice would rise, and this is St. Mark's Church, and it was pretty powerful for me. The Lower East Side became my focus. Art became my focus. The making of art became my focus. And it was easy to tag one after another. Like David Wojnarowicz led to Mike Bidlow, that led to the Civilian Warfare Gallery, that led to Richard Hamilton, which led to Greer Langton. And these were all like, edge people living in the Lower East Side. So I'd shoot them at their place, or out where they were working, or at a gallery opening. The end papers was an idea I had, because I would collect all the flyers from all the exhibitions. They would come daily in the 80s and even in the late 70s. And I just kept them all, and I realized that would make it pretty hot end papers. And sure enough, there's some Keith Haring, Richard Mock, who's in the book. In the body of the book, it was almost all artists, photographers, filmmakers. But in the introduction, I wanted to point out that there was also writers like Kurt Vonnegut, Henry Kissinger, a loft I had on 6th Avenue, and 29th. That's where Eugene Smith came for dinner one night. That was thrilling for me as a photographer, historian. Annie Sprinkle was very, very important in my time in New York because I met her on the street. I introduced myself to her. I was on Lexington Avenue. I had a studio on between 27th and 28th on Park Avenue, and she lived on Lexington Avenue between 27th and 26th. And when I introduced myself to her, she said, I started taking photographs because of you, Eric. I saw your book, Sex Objects, and that's what I realized I wanted to do. And in her case, Annie worked at massage parlors. She was right in on the whole sex scene. And I started meeting the most interesting people from her. And you'll see a layout in here of Steve Bonji, who was a Hell's Angel, became a Hell's Angel, or Candida Royale, who started films for more for women, more for the respect for women in the sex business. Me and John Sex, holding hands with John Sex. So I would invite oftentimes people I got to know in the scene from clubs back to my studio. So this was one night on 28th Street in Park Avenue. I love this image. It's a cement dinosaur in an abandoned lot in Lower East Side. So this is David in his apartment on the Lower East Side. You can see the gargoyle heads in his kitchen. Then we went outside and I didn't know where we were going. He was leading the way. He was always smoking. We would stop somewhere and take photographs. And there are great pictures of him where he had his mouth sewn together. That's not in this case, but he did a lot of really radical stuff. This is an opening at the Civilian Warfare for his exhibition, and there are a lot of people in this photograph. Kastabi, the artist Kastabi. But you can see, I mean, art was the scene. You know, look how packed it is. You can sort of tell. But then I was sent to photograph someone named Madonna. I had no idea who she was. And I asked her to pray. She didn't like that very much, but she did it. I knew not too many people had seen Madonna like this, and so I thought it was a good idea. Really important to my life in New York in this world was Nam June Paik, the Korean video artist. That dude right there. And I met him in the 70s at a Martha Jackson gallery event where he had Charlotte Moorman playing a cello made from monitors. And I brought him the photographs I had taken, and I found out where he lived in Soho, so I went there, and when I handed him the photographs, he threw them on the ground and then spun around like a child and sat down on the ground and looked at them and really enjoyed himself. And I thought, this is the guy I want to work with. This guy has that wisdom that Picasso speaks about. You have to see everything as if for the first time. He has appeared to be out of it, but he wasn't out of it at all. He was just distracted or whatever, wherever his mind was. And he'd say, I'd run into him in Soho, 2 o'clock in the morning, and he'd say, Eric, I owe you money. And then I'd go to his place in Soho, and he'd write me not that night, but he'd write me a funky check that I knew was worth more than cashing it, but I needed the money. And so, yeah, that goes back. And so he would give me stuff, but I knew that there was nothing that was really showing how imaginative he was. And then one day I brought him a tailor's head, and I said, draw me a face. And he drew me eyes made of television monitors and some other stuff and a face that was really cool, really nice. So I have that. He had said to me, Eric, I think that this is in 1976, let's say. I think that telephones that show you that you can see the person is going to be a big boon to the pajama business. So I want you to get a model to model various nightwear to show as if it were a fashion show. So we're in the inner sanctum of the AT&T building. You had to have FBI clearance to be in this room. And he's teaching a course to students in UCLA, and we are in New York City. And the whole idea is this experimental concept of a visual phone where you see the person you're talking to. And as conceptually, he had a modeling fashion, nightwear, nightgowns and stuff like that. And I chose, of course, my future wife, Linka. And I remember her saying, "I don't understand. He has said nothing to me." And he wouldn't give any direction at all. He would just let it go and see where it went to. And so not only was I there and my future wife, but this guy is a blind saxophone player. That's Shigeko Kuboto, his Pike's wife, and other luminaries from the art world and the inner sanctum of the AT&T building. So you can sort of feel it. You can sort of feel this cat is way out, and I'm along for the ride. And I really dug it. I dug that whole experience. As anyone who knows me knows, I'm crazy about photographing women, particularly in this reportage. And I read somewhere that there was going to be a hot pants contest in Rockaway Beach Playland, which was my first lesson in how the real world works. So the women came and they were wearing their hot pants and they were cool, getting their hair ready and putting on curlers. And at the last minute, a manufacturer of hot pants came in and the women had to wear their hot pants. Love this image, love this image. And so when I laid the book out, I wanted to have a flow from a Nam June Paik performance to a hot pants contest to Madonna in the basement of Danceteria. It was all there over those years. I like this. It wasn't until I made the prints that I realized, for example, this woman's arm in the picture, which was kind of cool. So it's important to realize that this was a trip through 20 years or more in New York City, my world. So it went back and forth from, this interest to that interest to this interest to that interest. Some were assignments, some were not. We're just out there at a club, because I never went home. I mean, that was my deal. I liked going out. Sometimes there would be moments where people came together that were really important in a particular aspect of the art scene in New York City. This was, of course, an important moment for me. Dondi, who's dead, Futura, who's alive, Herring, that's dead, and Kano, who's alive. And, maybe once they were all together in a room, So that was nice. Patty Astor. But in my journal, I'd asked various people to make a doodle of sorts. So he did that, as you can see here. That's the exploding baby. There's a picture later on in the book of him in the back seat with Kenny Sharp's wife and Warhol in the front seat and Kenny Sharp driving. And he wanted a copy of that, so I went to his place. And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, I knew you drew John Kennedy," so he gave me a drawing, like that, of John Kennedy. And I learned something from him that day, because as I was leaving, he said, "Wait a minute." So he called me back, and he opened his file cabinet, and he compared the other drawing that he had from the same drawing session, and he kept the better one, he said, and gave me the less better one. And that was an interesting lesson for me, because back then I would always try and give the better print away, because I was insecure or whatever. But that piece, which my ex-wife has, is worth $500,000. You know, so the way it rolls, you know. Civilian Warfare Gallery, which is coming up later in the book, was really important, but certainly the Fun Gallery was really important. Patty Astor's scene, because she gave everyone their first shows. Like Kenny Scharf, he gave an early show to Dondi, an early show to Keith Haring, an early show to... I'm still friends with Futura, who's coming up. But it helped that both in the case of Futura, he had a child when I did. So we were going through the same life experiences together. So we've remained friends. A lot of them, unfortunately, died. Pee Wee Herman. I must have gone to Carol's club without anyone hiring me.
Was that the Pee Wee Herman show that I remember that in like 1980 or something?
No, this was at the Carolines later, when he was bigger. But I brought my Seamless to the club and set it up. I mean, I was really dedicated photographer.
Yeah.
Never sleeping, never, ever sleeping. And sometimes it was large format, you know, and other times it wasn't. So this was a club scene. It was Ann Magnuson, you know, and I went to her apartment and shot her. So there's a shot, those are Polaroids from my journal.
Eric Bogosian?
Yeah, you know who that is, right?
I know who he is, yeah, I don't know him, but...
Yeah, he was cool.
Interesting guy.
Yeah, very interesting guy. But I remember his studio, going to his studio. And then, you know, I went out every night somewhere. And this was in the Pyramid Club. I knew what everybody looked like. So if I ran into Isabella Rossellini, I knew who she was. I knew what she had done, and I'd approach her, you know. And that's how I got to photograph a lot of people. Balls. You know, no problem with saying, hey, can I take your photograph? She had been mugged. I asked if she would come back to my studio, I think it was. And so I did her photograph, which, I mean, I knew when I was lucky. I knew when I had gotten something that would be really hard to get. She was a secretary down on the street. My studio at the time was on 28th and Park. Susan Smith, who I'm still friends with. And she was living in an SRO, single room occupancy hotel. That was cool. And Barbara Butterfly, I met her at a New York Dolls concert for Halloween, I think it was. Yeah, probably Halloween. And at the Waldorf Astoria. She was topless at the Waldorf Astoria. That stood out in my mind. Mary, crazy about her. She was handing out drug rehabilitation information. Another place was CBGB's, rich in visual material. This is Harley on a Sunday afternoon slam dancing matinee, you know. And yeah, and then he and I became friends, and we're still in touch now.
Do you shoot the Kroll mags?
No, I shot him only, you know. Outside CBGB's, and then Steve Bader's. I mean, there was a guy making videos, and somehow I got hooked into him, Swenson. He was married to one of the big rock girls in New York, and so I just sort of followed his lead, and he'd say, come to this rehearsal. So I went to a Debbie Harry rehearsal, and I went to, I'm sure he was one who suggested I come this particular evening for the Dead Boys, who was the house band for CBGB's. But this is probably the most iconic evening performance, because on YouTube you can see me in the front row. And I couldn't take enough of this. I mean, he was so visual. Plus, the whole reason for this book was this woman, Gia, saying, you should do a book on your punk stuff. And I said, no, I don't have that much punk stuff. So I filled it with as much punk stuff as I could. And so this is, you asked what are some popular images. This one is. Because people would see and said, I didn't know you took that. Yeah, I took it. But then there was Mapplethorpe, and I'm sure this was done for a downtown paper. And what's interesting about this was he said, hey, I've never used strobe. Tell me about strobe. And I had a chimera softbox. He was fascinated by that. And then there was Kenneth Anger. That's a very typical New York story where I got a call from Vanity Fair saying, Eric, do you have any pictures of Kenneth Anger? And I said, no, I don't. And I went almost immediately up to the Museum of Modern Art to see a show. And if you know anything about the Museum of Modern Art, it's famous for its glass doors. You went in half of it and came out the other half. And coming out the other half was Kenneth Anger. And I said, Kenneth Anger, Vanity Fair wants a picture of you. Why don't you get them a photograph? And he looked at me. I was prettier then. And he said, why don't you come by? So I did, but I brought my child, my 1-year-old, there's a picture of her crawling on the floor, But that's the same day that I ran, because my wife said, you better get some color film. I got a feeling you're going to want to shoot this Kenneth Anger's place in color. And she was right. But on the way to find color film on a Sunday, maybe, we see Warhol and in the front seat with Kenny Scharf, and they pull over, and I knew them all from photographing him. And Andy Warhol came out and did Polaroids of Leah as a baby on the sidewalk. So that was kind of cool. Leah's always asking me, where are they? I have no idea where they are. But so there's somewhere in the archive are Polaroids that Andy Warhol took of Leah. Richard Kern, who you know well, and this was part of our practicing erotica. That was on a well, and the bathroom here is a picture he did that same day. Colored gels, I guess.
In his New York girls book?
I guess, well, you have it in your wall in here in the bathroom. Yeah, that sounds about right. Can you see this? This is Charles Gatewood, and I met him through Annie Sprinkle and at Annie's place on Lexington Avenue.
They both ended up in San Francisco, and you did too.
Yeah, we all did, right. This is a great guy, Versailles, the great photographer. That's one of his pieces in the back, famous. And he was great. Great to meet him. And when I showed him my photographs, they were the photographs I had shot for the book Sex Objects, which hadn't come out yet. And he kept saying, prostitute? It was cute.